Support comes from Mosby Building Arts, helping families love their homes again. Inspiration at callmosby.com.
This is St. Louis on the Air from St. Louis Public Radio. I'm Elaine Cha. The advice to turn on, tune in, and drop out is a famous piece of wisdom from psychedelic pioneer Timothy Leary. He became famous in the 1960s for his belief that using drugs like LSD could bring a person into contact with an inner divinity, something beyond reality.
After you turn on, you tune in. And you can't turn on and tune in unless you systematically, gently, aesthetically begin to detach yourself from the immediate tribal game, which is always anthill. And this process of detaching yourself, tuning in, we call drop out.
That was Timothy Leary giving a lecture at UCLA in 1967. At the time, there was a St. Louis native at his side, his wife, Rosemary Woodruff Leary, who spent much of her life overshadowed by her famous husband. But a new book is shining a fresh light on the contributions of Rosemary Woodruff Leary and revealing a whole new side of the psychedelic revolution. St. Louis on the Air producer Danny Wysentowski has that story.
Timothy Leary was called the most dangerous man in America by President Richard Nixon. And today, Leary is remembered for his psychedelic experimentation as a Harvard professor, his ascent as an icon of the 1960s counterculture. But in the shadow of that legacy is the story of Rosemary Woodruff Leary, a St. Louis native who became his wife and who made her own mark in that era. The two attained a status of almost celebrity, partying with the Beatles and doing a lot of LSD. In the news reports and books of that time, Rosemary, though, is a side character, always the wife of Timothy Leary. But a new book from author Susannah Cahalan confirms that there is so much more to her than that. Cahalan's book flips that dynamic around, focusing on Rosemary's role in turning her husband into a cultural symbol, helping him escape from prison in 1971, becoming international fugitives together. The book also tells the story of what happened decades later, after Timothy Leary and Rosemary separated, and she returned to America to live a quiet, anonymous life in Cape Cod where no one knew her. Cahalan is a New York Times bestselling author and a graduate of Washington University, and her latest book is titled The Acid Queen, The Psychedelic Life and Counterculture Rebellion of Rosemary Woodruff Leary. Susannah Cahalan, welcome back to St. Louis on the Air.
It's so good to be back. Thank you for having me.
So, Susannah, this is a book whose subject really requires that we understand another person, Timothy Leary, alongside Rosemary Woodruff Leary. And so I think we want to get into who Rosemary was, her growing up in St. Louis, but remind us a bit of who Timothy Leary is and why he is still someone who commands a lot of attention and mystery.
Oh, absolutely. So, yeah, you're right. You really can't understand Rosemary Woodruff Leary without really understanding Timothy Leary. He was, a psychologist. He started out in California. He was born in Massachusetts, but then started his career in California as a researcher mainly. And then he started to get into psychedelics, and while he was at Harvard, and there kind of made a name for himself within that field. This was before psychedelics were illegal, and they were very much studied in major institutions and by psychiatrists and psychologists. But he started to develop a little bit of a reputation. He was giving these substances to his students. He was taking them himself. He also kind of held raucous parties at his house in near Harvard in Cambridge, and he was fired along with a few of his compatriots there, professors, and started a more public-facing movement, basically, as the kind of high priest of acid. He started to be known as this kind of acid promoter, this evangelical kind of face of the growing countercultural movement revolving around psychedelics, the so-called
Right.
heads.
Yeah, and it's that movement. If he was the acid king, Rosemary
Yes.
Woodruff Leary, she is in that monarchy in a really important way. So take us back then. Rosemary is born in St. Louis, and she does spend her early life here. Can you tell us a bit about what you learned about her family here and what influences she might have picked up while living here that she carried with her into a much more adventurous and chaotic life later on?
Absolutely. So Rosemary was born in 1935 in St. Louis. Her family, her father was a railroad worker. He was a freight handler, and her mother worked for Anheuser-Busch, and they lived around Carondelet Park around on Hummel Avenue. And according to the census at the time, they rented a house, a very small kind of tract home for about $15 a month on the South Side. So she writes very fondly about, picking tomatoes from the vines around her home, walking in the park, swimming in the park, on her bicycle. I mean, a very kind of idyllic those early years in St. Louis were described in very idyllic terms. And she had her first mystical experience at age 7 in St. Louis, walking around her neighborhood. She suddenly had this feeling that she was plugged into an electrical grid, as she describes it, that all of a sudden she felt as if she was connected to kind of everything in the world. And this was not induced by it wasn't induced by any drugs. It was a totally spontaneous experience. And it's one that stayed with her, and I would argue really shaped the rest of her life to come.
And she really seemed to seek some kind of mysticism and something profound. And it sounds like she found that, or believes she found that, in the way that Timothy Leary was talking about acid and talking about drugs. And I think, it seems easy to kind of just write things off as drug use or people getting high, but these are folks who really believed there was something profound in the way that acid or LSD could be used. How did she comes into contact with Timothy Leary, I think when she's around 30 in New York City. How does she get introduced, as the acid queen to acid?
Yeah, so this happened all before Timothy Leary, and that's what's
Wow.
so fascinating about her as a character, is that she lived many lives even before becoming a name by being associated with Timothy Leary. So she left St. Louis at age 17. She had married an Air Force officer, and it was a very abusive relationship, and she fled that relationship and ended up in New York working as a model and then as a stewardess. And it was there that she started to rub shoulders with the beats of the era. And she learned not only, about jazz music and, the amazing kind of literature coming out of the movement, but she also learned how to use drugs. And one of her friends, a woman, a fellow divorcee, actually, like herself, introduced her to LSD. And LSD at the time, again, it was not illegal, it was legal. And many psychotherapists were actually using these LSD with their patients. And around the time that Rosemary had her first acid experience, which was in the mid 1960s, these substances were starting to escape the couch and really entering the counterculture. And she was very much a part of that culture. And that first experience, she really had a very mystical experience. And she felt, I think, in many ways, a connection to that 7-year-old experience she had back in St. Louis. And from that point forward, psychedelics, mainly acid, became a mainstay in her life.
Your book is very deeply sourced to Rosemary's primary writings. You had access to her archives. You were reading her diaries, her most personal writings. You are also looking at Timothy Leary's personal writings from this time, his own books. These two things do not always overlap cleanly. There are contradictions. And I thought it was fascinating as this book begins its narrative, when we begin to see Rosemary meeting Timothy Leary and getting wrapped up into his life, these dueling perspectives and her interior feelings and his public statements that often show how perhaps little he has regard for her or how little she is a part of this moment. What was this research like? And could you tell us maybe a bit what stands out to you as you began to fit these two perspectives together, these two people writing about these same incidents?
Oh, that's such a great question. And it was exciting as a researcher because I had so much information. Leary was hypergraphic, essentially. I mean, he wrote about himself constantly. And he also was a self-mythologizer, and he was keeping his archives way before he actually was famous enough to have such archives. And so there's a lot of material. In fact, a majority of his archives are located at the New York Public Library in 400 bankers' boxes, if you can imagine. And Rosemary was also keeping a diary. She also was working on a book later in her life. And she too has archives at the New York Public Library, but she has 25, a much more manageable 25 bankers' boxes worth of material. But as you said, I did, as I was piecing this all together, using their, primary sources, books that Leary wrote, other people's recollections, I started to notice that there were discrepancies. Some of them were fairly minor. An initial conversation about when Rosemary decided to go off with Timothy Leary, he recalled things differently than she did. Sometimes in funny discrepancies in terms of what she was wearing. Rosemary remembered in one case during a raid when the police came that she was wearing a thick cotton gown sewn by her grandmother, whereas Timothy Leary basically remembered her nearly naked. And so there was, those are minor, but then there are larger discrepancies. And there are larger discrepancies about their philosophies about psychedelics as well that I felt were substantial. And in the opening of The Acid Queen, I actually acknowledged this fact that there are discrepancies. And in this version of events, these are Rosemary's. This is on Rosemary's terms. And of course, I fact-checked her too. But if there were discrepancies and I couldn't find a third source to confirm or deny, I went with Rosemary's version of events. And this is the first time that anyone's gone with her version over Timothy's.
Are there any moments of contradiction or claims that Timothy Leary made that were quite different, or that you find, after looking into Rosemary's version, less believable?
I mean, there are so many. He's a confabulator in a bit. He loves to exaggerate. He's a trickster, so he's unreliable. But Rosemary, too, I found discrepancies that were, for example, her father, Verl, who worked in the railroad, he also was an amateur magician. And she writes about a picture that I eventually tracked down, and she describes him in top hat and tails, performing this magic trick. And it was only that when I found a letter between Rosemary and her mother describing that same picture that I realized that actually Verl was not the magician, he was the magician's assistant. You would think maybe that's a minor discrepancy, but I don't. And so there were instances on both sides where I had to have a little bit of a gimlet eye when I was dealing with these two very interesting, very dynamic, very complicated characters.
The theme of magic, of magicians, of tricks, people who intend to trick their audience, you bring this up several times in this book. You actually compare both Timothy Leary and Rosemary Leary, two magicians who are working a kind of magic on each other and the people around them. There are times where it sounds like they are in charge of a cult. Could you explain, what was the magic that they produced together and that really gathered a significant number of people and national attention?
Oh, I think that's great. I mean, there was a way in which Timothy Leary especially was able to transfix an audience, and you kind of have to give some context at the time. Timothy was Timothy's face, Timothy's words in a book called The Psychedelic Experience in particular, his writings in the media. Those were the first times many people in America had ever heard about psychedelic drugs. And they were using his manual when they were taking those drugs. They set up the altar the way that he did. They followed his book, which was based on the Tibetan Book of the Dead. And they, arranged their trips around the words of Timothy Leary. I mean, even the Beatles did. And they wrote about, they actually sang and used part of the psychedelic experience in Tomorrow Never Knows. Relax and float downstream is actually a direct line from Timothy Leary's psychedelic experience. So Leary was really shaping the way people were experiencing these drugs. And Rosemary was helping him do that. She was not only shaping him in terms of the way he looked. She was helping sew his clothing. She was helping, create the image that he appeared. He went from a professor, kind of professorial tweeds from Harvard, into a more guru-like presentation, which you would see white linen, bare feet, open button shirts. And she also was helping him write some of his kind of quippy slogans. She was editing his work. And again, these were huge, huge pieces, monumental pieces of literary criticism, literary, media, his face, his words. They were shaping a whole generation. And Rosemary was very much involved with that.
So on that point, because I think a lot of folks, even those who are familiar with Timothy Leary, who maybe aren't old enough to have lived through that era, Rosemary Leary, I think for a lot of folks, this might be one of the first times they're hearing about her. You write in your introduction that her life does present this kind of unfamiliar hero's journey, that she is everywhere and nowhere, a woman who stood unnoticed on the edge of the world stage. You yourself kind of encountered her almost by chance while you were shopping, and it's because like her aesthetic has almost become turned into a brand, a shorthand for that kind of 1960s vibe. How did you first learn about her? What drew you to this person who a lot of folks, have at least seen as kind of a side character?
I'm like you. I had never heard of her before, and I was kind of flirting with the idea of writing about psychedelics because there's such an interesting time in the culture in medicine, and I'm interested in consciousness and the brain, mind, and I had written a little bit about about psychedelics in my 2 prior books. In Brain on Fire, I wrote about ketamine and dissociatives, and in The Great Pretender, my second book, I wrote about psychedelics in general and their role in the design of psychiatric hospitals in Canada, which was fascinating. But so, a few researchers had reached out to me, interested in kind of comparing the psychotic experience versus the psychedelic one, and I found that very interesting. And so whenever you start looking into psychedelics, you come up against the name Timothy Leary. And so I started to do some research on him, and at the New York Public Library became aware of those archives there. But at the same time, in a kind of very serendipitous, synchronistic kind of experience that Rosemary would love, I was at a beautiful boutique clothing store in Brooklyn, and I was perusing the kind of clothes, and I found this amazing dress that was covered in black poppies. And I put it back on the rack. I didn't have anywhere to wear this dress, to. And so I actually ended up Googling the brand after, just because I was interested in it. And it was a brand, a Swedish brand called Röda Beer. And that dress happened to be from the 2020 collection, inspired by a psychedelic pioneer, as the brand Röda Beer described her, Rosemary Woodruff Leary. And it just felt like there were these arrows pointing to Rosemary, and I had to just follow that path that was opening up for me. And once I became deeply kind of immersed in her world, reading her unpublished book and getting into her diaries, I had her tax returns, I had it all, and I realized, wow, this is a person who is very substantial, very important, and really deserves a critical look.
We need to take a quick break, but we'll be back shortly to continue this conversation with Susannah Cahalan, author of The Acid Queen, The Psychedelic Life and Counterculture Rebellion of Rosemary Woodruff Leary. This is St. Louis on the Air on St. Louis Public Radio.
This is St. Louis Public Radio. Support comes from Perrick Corporation. With a commitment to serving the St. Louis community through local partnerships and charitable support, guided by Perrick's core values. More at perrick.com/culture.
Welcome back. I'm Elaine Cha. Let's return to our conversation with New York Times bestselling author Susannah Cahalan She's the author of a new book, The Acid Queen, The Psychedelic Life and Counterculture Rebellion of Rosemary Woodruff Leary. Before the break, Cahalan and St. Louis on the Air producer Danny Wysentowski were discussing Rosemary's childhood in St. Louis. Here's Danny.
One of the things that really becomes clear in your book, The Acid Queen, as we are learning and following Rosemary Leary as she is becoming part of her famous husband's life, seeing these talks, going to this commune together with a lot of his other followers, that line that you kind of reference between the psychedelic experience and the psychotic experience, it seems like she and the others begin to notice that there is a wrong way to experience drugs, and that despite this being very subjective, that LSD could break someone's mind, that if someone does not go into it with the intentions or in a bad place, bad trip wasn't just a shorthand term. Like, this was something that could really impact someone's mental health and their personality. You write about this in the importance of her role in developing this idea of set and setting, and that is something that is still happening today around the use of psychedelics. What was she doing at that time, and how did those terms become in use?
Oh, that's such a great observation. Set and setting was key. Leary initially popularized that, especially with the psychedelic experience. And the idea was that from Timothy Leary's perspective, that you could guide and orient a trip to ego death. So you could get to a place of ego death as opposed to just taking these drugs and seeing what happens. You could actually orient them. Now, Rosemary's perspective on set and setting was a little different, and I would argue that extends beyond Rosemary to many of the quieter forces who are largely female behind the scenes. For Rosemary, who would be called this queen of setting, set and setting was really a way to preserve and safeguard and help someone during an experience. It wasn't necessarily the goal was ego death, though I think that was underlying. But really, Rosemary was there to make sure that people came out intact, that people and had a positive experience. And that involved everything from the colors of the throws and the couch cushions, from what she wears. She actually designed and created outfits for people to wear that were very comfortable. She cooked calming and grounding foods. She was the kind of person who would have been there with a glass of water just at the right time. And these were key parts of keeping people, making sure that people were safe. That was not as much the intention of the very kind of machismo, we're going to blast our minds off into space perspective of the very male-dominated viewpoints of people like Timothy Leary. What was happening were people like Rosemary were behind the scenes really taking care of people, cleaning up vomit, really doing the caregiving work that was so essential to making sure that this was a safe experience.
You write, and I believe your afterword, that you attempted for a time to try to live a bit like Rosemary Leary and do the yoga she had done, the music. Rosemary did, as you mentioned, live in some pretty far out circumstances. How far did you take that lifestyle?
I did. I really tried to embody. It was an interesting experience because my two prior books didn't have that opportunity. This is an entirely different experience, writing a biography of a woman like this. And I felt it was important to understand her relationship with things like the tarot and the I Ching. And as you said, I did her yoga and breath work, but I only went so far, right? I didn't myself do psychedelics. I'm not a psychonaut. I had a very extreme experience with an altered state caused by an autoimmune disease of my brain, which I wrote about in my first book, which is called Brain on Fire. And so I'm very cognizant of the risks involved with, doing anything that involves messing with your brain. And so I was circumspect, and I talked to a lot of people about that because in some ways I did want to understand. In this attempt to embody, I thought I really do want to see what that's like. And I had psychedelic experience in my youth, but not as an adult since I was sick. And I talked to enough people where I talked to a wonderful woman who was an elder, and she put it very simply. She said, if you have to ask, you shouldn't do it. And I took those words to heart, and I found other ways to connect with that search, that connection, that attempt to find a greater meaning that she found, again, without drugs when she was 7 years old. So that was really my effort of embodiment there, without actually becoming a psychonaut myself.
So your book really focuses on, I think, a couple of the main periods of Rosemary Leary's relationship with Timothy Leary. And later in our conversation, we'll talk about what happens when the law gets involved. Timothy Leary goes to prison, escapes from prison, and they go on the lam. But there is this period from the mid-1960s until 1970 at this mansion called Millbrook. And it's here, I'm curious, from what you found in her writings, it sounds like this was a place where folks were trying to create an acid utopia, and perhaps for a time found that utopia, but where folks, including Rosemary, found themselves in a cycle of drug use that put them in a place that, as you referenced, I think we would call inhumane conditions today, the way that they lived their lives in the throes of that kind of acid use. What happened at Millbrook, and how important was Rosemary to the good that seemed to happen there and the things that fell apart?
Oh, great question. I mean, I think, Millbrook, this kind of, it was a site of experimentation. A lot of the ex-Harvard, Leary and company, people from Harvard and other places, came there to test the limits of their own minds in a way to kind of change society. They really felt that ritualistic, prolonged LSD use could not only just change their minds, it could change and transform society. So there were experiments in communal child rearing. There were experiments in farming, in vegetarianism, and there were, however, as most places of great vast idealism, over time it turned sour, and there was a lot of infighting. There were various factions. So Timothy Leary and his group were they formed a religion called the League for Spiritual Discovery, which Rosemary obviously was a part of. And then there was an ashram on the grounds, and there was another competing religion, and so there were infighting, and there was clashes of personality, and there tended to be a lot of talk of this kind of transformation of society and the self, but in actuality, you saw many of the same patterns of the era repeating. And one of those same patterns was misogyny and a hierarchy between the men and women in the house. The men, they were involved in these, very egoic searches of the self through psychedelic use and other uses, while the women were relegated off into the kitchen, and they were expected to clean up and make the meals. And so, this was a place that was a bit of a powder keg, and initially had so much promise, and there was a lot of real true belief there. But over time, it started to sour, and even the conditions there, as you mentioned, were borderline disgusting. And one photographer who I interviewed, who visited the campus, not the campus, but the location called Millbrook, actually described it in kind of horrified terms. I mean, he saw children with huge diapers that hadn't been changed, and half the people had moved out into the grounds and were living in teepees that they had erected, that were not properly built. And, it was a place that was, in disrepair. And it was clear what was going to happen, what was eventually did, which was the town surrounding the estate did not like that this was happening. This is a very bucolic, this is a very fairly fancy area of upstate New York, and they did not like the rogues gallery of visitors coming to their town. And eventually the law started to descend on the Millbrook community there, and it wasn't long before they were kicked out and had to find other places to stay.
By the late 1960s, and certainly by 1970, Timothy Leary is involved in several high-profile criminal cases against him for things like marijuana possession. Rosemary Leary, his wife, is involved in some of these cases, and this escalates to a point where they become international fugitives, and Rosemary isn't just, helping him build his persona. She is part of a movement or something that is much closer to the militant liberation movements happening in this era. How do things escalate so quickly, and what is Rosemary's role here in defending and ultimately freeing her husband from prison?
Yes. So the time, at that time, there's the rise of the New Left, and Leary and his fellow, who were called heads, people who were, basically psychedelic users, they made kind of strange bedfellows with the fists, as they were called, the people who were really championing political change. And at first, Timothy, who was considerably older than the majority of the other people in the New Left, who were largely part of the youth generation, he was born in 1920. He was not a baby boomer. And so, there was a period of time where he was considered a bit out of touch. But what happened was when they had to leave Millbrook, they ended up in California. And while in California, Leary decided to run for governor of California against Ronald Reagan, which definitely upset the establishment, and he became a greater target of law enforcement. And at that point, after 2 marijuana busts, he actually faced over almost 30 years in prison for marijuana possession. And it became clear to the members of the underground and the New Left that he was being scapegoated, that he was basically what they called him, a martyr to the movement. And at that point, the various factions of the New Left actually saw him as someone that they wanted to stand behind, that they wanted to help. And Rosemary became very much involved in that. As Leary was behind bars, Rosemary became the new face of the movement. And her nickname at that point became the Acid Queen. And at that point, she was, the one that the media went to for interviews. And she showed off her ability to she was very mediagenic, very quick-witted, very quick with a great quote. And she did her job well. And, people like Abby Hoffman, who was a member of the Yippies, who disparaged Leary before, once Rosemary took charge and Timothy was behind bars and clearly unfairly, they started to really stand behind him. And at that point, Rosemary was the one who became what she called the computer. She was the kind of the person who held all the information. And she became the kind of linchpin that held together the various factions of the New Left that came together to help free him. And those factions were the Weather Underground, the Black Panthers, and a group of kind of, I would say, a surfer mafia types called the Brotherhood of Eternal Love.
Wow.
And together, with Rosemary as the kind of glue, they managed to help Leary escape from prison.
So let me, on all of those incredible connections and getting Leary out of prison and, the Weather Underground, Leary, incredibly, he scales a prison wall. I think he does a lot in this escape, and it's a wild story on its own. But he and Rosemary escape, they make it out of the country, and it just seems like Timothy Leary does not know when to let up. He is his own worst problem often. The tension does not get reduced. What did you learn about how Rosemary was operating as she's on the run? I was just waiting for a moment where I just wanted her to shake Timothy Leary and say, chill out, man. Yeah. You are making things a lot worse.
No, I mean his racial politics, his views of gender dynamics are very outdated, regressive, and Rosemary did, eventually come kind of out of a stupor. She described it as a folie à deux, like she was in a shared delusion with him. And once the scales fell from her eyes, she couldn't unsee what she saw. And she saw someone who was very much a clown, someone who loved fame more than anything else. And as you say, it became extremely apparent. We all saw, there as writing her her perspective, I too wanted to shake her and say, come on,
exactly.
Get out of here.
Why didn't she? Why didn't she get out of there sooner?
It's a great question. I think, and I can answer from my perspective because I don't fully know from hers, though she does write a bit about why. I think, what was waiting for her on the other side? She was now a fugitive from the law. She was facing her own time behind bars. She dropped out of high school. She had no career prospects. She had aged out of her being her airline stewardess career. And she was facing a very uncertain life and probably jail time. So she was bound to him. And she also describes that she felt a sense of honor and duty in agreeing to marry him, that she described it as mated to him. And she felt that she was going to be there with him through thick and thin. And I think she saw a greatness in him, a greatness that sometimes I think maybe he didn't deserve. But she saw that in him, and I think she believed that one day he would be worthy of her esteem. That because she had seen him at his best at various points before, but over time it was clear that he was not going to be the person she needed him to be.
We need to take a quick break, but we'll be back shortly to continue this conversation about the life of St. Louis native Rosemary Woodruff Leary with author Susannah Cahalan. When we return, we'll hear more about how Rosemary finally separated herself from Timothy Leary and how, late in life, she came forward to tell her side of the story. This is St. Louis on the Air on St. Louis Public Radio.
If you have a smart speaker, you have access to the entire world of NPR and St. Louis Public Radio. All the latest news and all the captivating stories. Activate our voices with yours by telling your smart speaker to play St. Louis Public Radio.
Welcome back. I'm Elaine Cha. We've spent our show today learning about the life of Rosemary Woodruff Leary, who was the wife of Psychedelic's evangelist Timothy Leary. Rosemary Woodruff Leary was born in St. Louis, and to talk about her life, producer Danny Wysentowski spoke with author Susannah Cahalan about her recent book, The Acid Queen, The Psychedelic Life and Counterculture Rebellion of Rosemary Woodruff Leary. Before the break, they were discussing Rosemary's key role in helping her husband escape prison, and what happened when their relationship finally began to unravel.
Rosemary Leary does separate from Timothy Leary finally in 1972. And I'm wondering, was there something in her writing or something that sticks with you that explains, what was at least that break that she was able to get away in that moment? Was it a single experience? Was it something in him?
I think the initial break was really a pause. It was a semicolon. And she needed a break from him. She had seen him act reprehensibly in Switzerland when they were on the run. She had seen him really embarrass her with the Black Panthers in Algeria when they were on the run. And I think she needed a break. And she went off with a younger man named John Schul, who became her kind of protector. And she expected to return. But a series of betrayals that are so outrageous occurred, including, other women, sure, but turning on Rosemary when he was actually apprehended by law enforcement and working with the federal government to try to track her down, and working with the feds to try to locate her and giving up, their secret code and their love letters when they were arranging the escape. I mean, a rank betrayal, I think, after that.
And he's seen to a great degree by folks as a betrayer of those movements of the Weather Underground, of others, yes. As Leary himself, I think, was exposed as an informant to the FBI.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, that's undeniable. And I think in many ways he was. I mean, He turned on almost everyone, including his own children. And yes, that is part of the story, undeniably.
So can skip to the end of the story a little bit. Decades pass, and it's in 1994 that Rosemary Leary, who has been living under an assumed name in Cape Cod, finally comes out of the shadows. She begins to try to establish herself, and she reconnects with Timothy Leary again. What stands out about you as you began to look into this, version of Rosemary Leary after she had already lived through this? Why did she go back to him in those final years of his life?
I think that the years she lived underground, she lived as Sarah Woodruff in Cape Cod, were years of real quiet contemplation, knitting herself back together without a man, without a primary male, person in her life. She could come into her own. I think in some ways she was more protected, more defended in terms of herself. I think she was less open at that point. But a few things happened that opened her back up to the possibility of really forgiving Leary. And one of them was the death of his daughter, who died by suicide in prison. And a very sad end of her life. And I think she and Susan had always had a very complicated relationship and a difficult one. And that kind of opened up a bit of the spigots that she had kind of tightened. And I think she was ready she knew what that must have meant to him, I think. And I think she was ready to forgive him in a way so that he could forgive himself for what happened to his daughter. It's conjecture.
Yeah, and Rosemary was close to Timothy's children in a way that he was not.
In many ways that he was not, especially his son, Jack. Yes.
Rosemary Leary dies in 2002, and you were able to talk to a lot of folks who knew her in that last chapter of her own life when she did step out and take on some of that legacy that she herself had built. What did they tell you about this version of Rosemary? Was she able to finally get credit or the spotlight that she did deserve for her role in this movement?
Yeah, by the time she came back above ground in 1994, and then Leary passes away in 1996, she does become, again, a face of the movement after being anonymous for very long. And by that time, people really described her as very tired, very quiet. There was an armor that she had developed all those years living underground took a toll. It took a toll on her physically. She was sick. She was frail. It took a toll on her psychologically. She trusted very few people. This was a kind of quiet and somber end for her. And she did take on an important role in the legacy of Timothy Leary and psychedelics in general. She became one of the key figures in preserving the Leary archive and finding a home for it. And she herself did continue writing her own book, though in her lifetime no one wanted to publish it. But it was a quiet end to such a kind of cinematic life.
There is a very tough question that is kind of buried in this book as it develops, I was feeling. And part of it is that Timothy Leary and this style of liberation and ascension through drugs and acid, through this kind of constant provocation, he made an enemy of Richard Nixon and a lot of the politicians at the time. And that is important because the war on drugs is declared by Richard Nixon seemingly almost in response to this kind of counterculture, through this rage he felt at someone like Timothy Leary, who was constantly thumbing his nose. And there are arguments that are still being made that this war on drugs is in large part a result of this personal feud and animosity that Nixon felt for someone like Leary. Where we are today, in Missouri has just sold $2 billion worth of legal cannabis, is very different. But these historical threads are still there. Is there some sense that you are making of this looking at the landscape of drug prohibition today? We're moving on from that war on drugs, and yet I think a lot of folks wonder, didn't Timothy Leary have a good point? Isn't that a society and a relationship with these drugs and substances that are worthwhile? Where do you see the balance there? Are we repairing the damage that Timothy Leary did, or still looking to replicate the goal he believed in.
Oh, that's great. I mean, I think it's a combination. Yes, I agree. Timothy Leary had some incredible points. And especially in his earlier years, I think he really understood and was very clear that psychedelics were serious substances with a lot of potential, but also risks. And that was initially how he presented his argument. But over time, as he became more over the top, more disconnected with the reality of the experience, he became more of a salesman, a proselytizer, and that was not good. And that was a kind of overcorrection. And what's interesting about the movement now in this very complicated relationship with Timothy Leary, in fact, a man named Rick Doblin, who is the kind of the face of the movement to legalize psychedelics, he's the head of an organization called MAPS. He talks all the time. In fact, most recently at a conference in MAPS just a few months ago, about burying the ghost of Timothy Leary. So Timothy Leary is very much on people's minds today, and I think for the reasons we see is the negative sides of Timothy Leary, which was this kind of over the top evangelical approach to psychedelic use. And this sensationalized view. But Timothy Leary did also say one day there will be departments at all the major universities dedicated to the study of psychedelics. And boy, was he correct. So I think there are things to take from Timothy Leary. I don't think he deserves to be buried. I think he deserves to be discussed in all his complicated legacy. But I do also think that there's an opportunity now to take in the quieter voices of people like Rosemary, who had a far more circumspect view about psychedelic use. She was someone who did not like what she called the kind of burden of turning people on, her words. She felt that it was a large responsibility. She actually likened it to Frodo from Lord of the Rings with a ring. She thought, this is a big power, and she didn't feel that she was the person who should be telling people that they should do it, that was an individual choice, and there was one that should be made out of a lot of contemplation, a lot of discussion of risks, a lot of concern about the setting that you step into. That, to me, is a voice we need to listen to today as we step forward into this very exciting potential of psychedelic use in the future.
Susannah, lastly, this whole book, an entire book dedicated to a single person, Rosemary Leary, is in tension with the fact that she is constantly being crowded out by her former husband, Timothy Leary. Even when she revealed herself in 1994, the headline from the New York Times, I think, or the headline was, yes, one of Timothy Leary's former wives comes in from the cold.
Yes.
She never gets that spotlight, or even in the moment, she's always someone's wife. But you also write in this book that she embraced that in a way, being a side character, being alongside someone. Did you find any balance in that? You dedicated an entire book to someone who frequently seemed not sure whether she deserved to be in a central role or why, or what her role really was. What was it that made you think this needs a full book? She needs to be in focus.
Oh, it was so exciting to take on someone who was typically off on the sidelines or at the edge of a frame. When you focus on someone who's typically not the center, you adjust the lens of the camera on her, and thus you take in new information around her. And so I really felt like writing this very intimate biography of Rosemary afforded a new perspective on a time in history, I think, that has been, the hagiography that we think we know all about, that we're kind of, that's been over mythologized. By taking her perspective that's, a little bit off center, I really do think that it tells a new story about that time. At least that's what I hope.
That was author Susannah Cahalan. Her latest book, The Acid Queen, The Psychedelic Life and Counterculture Rebellion of Rosemary Woodruff Leary, came out in April. She spoke last week with producer Danny Wysentowski.
This episode was produced by Danny Wysentowski.
Audio engineering and podcast design by Aaron Dorr.
Our executive producer is Alex Hoyer.
St. Louis on the Air is a production of St. Louis Public Radio. Understanding starts here.
Do you find yourself regularly listening to episodes of St. Louis on the Air? Suggest us to a friend you think might enjoy our conversations, and leave us a review and rating on Apple Podcasts on the App Store. It's the simplest way to help people discover our show. Thank you.
St. Louis Public Radio is a member-supported service of the University of Missouri St. Louis.
The Gateway brings you the day's news each weekday from around the St. Louis region and the state capitals in Jefferson City.
Our schools are accredited. We don't need this bill.
And Springfield.
How many more years must pass before lawmakers see time is of the essence?
I'm Abby Larico. Join me each weekday for The Gateway on the STLPR app or wherever you get podcasts.